In today's episode of Remembering World War II, we'll discuss why Hitler had to launch Fall Blau and defeat the Soviet Union in 1942. It's spring 1942, and the German and Soviet armies are standing off along thousands of miles of front in the east. Like two exhausted boxers tied up and leaning against one another after throwing every punch they could muster during Operation Barbarossa and the winter campaigns of 1941, the bell finally rang. Now it was time for them to return to their corners to lick their wounds, regroup, and plan the next round of the fight. For Germany, it was almost unthinkable to have to stand back up for another round given the fact that they gave their everything in the first rounds of Barbarossa and Operation Typhoon. The Soviets took unparalleled amounts of damage, more than any army has ever sustained up until present day, and yet somehow managed to avoid the knockout blow and live to fight another day. But if they were to survive this war beyond 1942, they needed a change in strategy, and they needed it quickly. The German OKH, or the German High Command, gave their recommendation to refrain from any major offensive campaigns in 1942, and instead advised Hitler to focus on rebuilding the battered armies in the Luftwaffe. Then, once they reached somewhere approaching full divisional strength in 1943, they should resume the attack and finish off the Soviet Union once and for all. The reason for this recommendation was that in their assessment, the Red Army was a spent force and was therefore in no position to entertain any offensive campaigns whatsoever, thus giving them the invaluable time that they needed to replenish their military. When presented with the blueprint for going on the defensive, Hitler would have none of it. In his mind's eye, the outlook to the war wasn't as singular as the High Command's naive worldview. He saw several reasons why going on the offensive in 1942 would be paramount for political, economic, and military reasons. First, Hitler did not want to appear weak in front of his Axis partners. What would Romania, Finland, Hungary, Italy, and Japan think if Hitler failed to resume his war of annihilation against the Soviets immediately at the first opportunity to strike? Germany needed the economic and military support of her allies now more than ever. After the losses of the winter 1941, what he needed desperately was additional manpower to replenish the ranks of his depleted infantry units. Second, following the need for manpower was Germany's insatiable need for fuel, which by 1942 was primarily provided by Romania. In the 6 months prior to Hitler's launching of the Soviet invasion, Germany had managed to build up petroleum reserves to an estimated 56 million barrels. With those reserves now depleted, to lose the backing of Romania at this stage in the war would halt Hitler's war machine in his tracks and be terminal for the German war effort overall. Third, Hitler was also mindful of his southern flank. If, for whatever reason, he lost the support of Italy, then the entire Balkans region along the Mediterranean coast would be completely exposed to attacks by the British, who had deep roots in North Africa, as well as the islands of Crete and Malta. Fourth, in the northern sector, the sustained support of the Finns was essential because it tied down enormous sums of Soviet troops having to defend Leningrad and the Soviet-Finnish border. The Finns were also one of Germany's largest trading partners and supplied metal ore such as nickel, magnesium, iron, and various other rare earth minerals. Fifth, another concern for Hitler arose from the home front. How would a failed Barbarossa campaign and stalemate in Russia go over with the German people? Indeed, how detrimental would this be to Hitler's public support and overall aura of invincibility as the greatest warlord to ever live, as Keitel once famously put it in 1940 after the conquest of France? Up until now, the German citizenry haven't felt the pains of war in the form of rationing and staggering amounts of their sons, husbands, and brothers' names lining the obituary columns day after day in the newspapers. Would they continue to support their Führer in difficult times the same way that they had when everything was conquest and rainbows? Sixth, there was also a matter of saving face with his own generals, who often looked at the World War I trench-running Lance Corporal with a certain amount of disdain and unsophistication. It was especially so after the winter of 1941 when Hitler sacked several top-ranking commanders for defeatism or insubordination and took direct command of the army himself. Their fate and Hitler's military judgment would be tested now that they found themselves entering the second year of a two-front war that was supposed to conclude in 6 to 10 weeks. Hitler needed to reassure not only the German people, but his general staff that he would see the war through to victory as the great leader, and that this momentary setback would immediately be forgotten once the final victory of 1942 came. Seventh, lastly, there was the sleeping giant that Hitler had unnecessarily awoken in his December 11th speech of 1941 to the Reichstag, where he declared war on the greatest manufacturing power the world has ever known. Yes, Hitler's declaration of war against none other than the United States of America had him looking down the barrel of a gun with an enemy possessing seemingly infinite resources and manufacturing capabilities whose effects would likely start to be felt no later than 1 year to the date. American industry would be put into full gear in 1942, and those supplies would surely start arriving by 1943 at the latest. What's worse, the United States produced over 59% of the world's oil production during World War II, a resource that Germany was starved of and desperately needed. Because of this, Hitler had to move in 1942, destroy what was left of the Soviet regime, and then he could begin drawing on his own seemingly infinite resources made available by conquering the Soviet Union and turn his domestic manufacturing effort into overdrive to compete with the Americans in the factories. So there it is, the reasons why Hitler had to launch Fall Blau and defeat the Soviet Union in the summer of 1942. Please stay tuned for the next episode of Remembering World War II, and thanks for watching.